Today we're going to look at Sarawakian history from a perspective that might be closer than you think, rather than the perspective that has been given by Islamic Malay historians. Now, I understand the importance of religion after the 17th century, after the Islamization of the Malay people. However, before the 17th century and prior to that, prior to Malacca, we have to look at the history of Southeast Asian maritime Malays in the perspective of the Hindu-Buddhist religion, if we want to get an idea as to how people thought and on all sorts. Now, there are many Muslims who would say that's going against religion. It's not actually. History is history. Religion is religion. When the two cross, then we shall use it. If not, then we're not being precise about history based on historical evidence, or even based on nuances. Now, this, of course, is my own nuance. I'd like to share two concepts from philosophy. One is teleology, and the other one is hermeneutics. Teleology is looking at the past based on our perceptions today. And in the case of Malay Muslim historians and historiography, they look at Malay and Islamic history even from before the coming of Islam from an Islamic perspective. That is teleology. We're putting on our own values today into the past, and it may not be very helpful. Hermeneutics is understanding the past from the ideals of the past. Now, if you want to look at 19th century Malay civilization, Malay history, like, let's say, Abdullah Munshi, or how the sultans of Johor and the Yang Tuan Negeri Sembilan and all these other people acted, or why J.W.W. Birch was assaulted for his colonialism and colonial tactics, perhaps looking at Islam and looking at Malay beliefs and looking at Malay adat might be very helpful. However, if you go back to the times of Majapahit and Srivijayan, it becomes less helpful, and that both apply to hermeneutics. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to be hermeneutically wrong and both teleologically wrong in my quirky tale of Sarawak's history. Sarawak is my beloved land, my beloved homeland, and has been part of the territories that formed modern-day Malaysia. All right? Now, Sarawak under the ages, a quirky history of Johan Sarawak, an English tale of Sarawak before the English. So I'm going to stop at English. Warning. This is intuistic history, notional, not factual. So don't quote me saying, oh, this is from a factual historian. It's part fact, part fiction. Okay? It's just a quirky history. I was very much influenced by our friend, what's his name? Who's the guy that does the BBC history stuff? Let me just take a look here. All the monarchs and kings. I mean, influenced by him, anyway. Let's just take a look, yeah? What's his name? I need to get his name first, okay. BBC historian of monarchies. Okay. Not come up just yet. But anyway, the name will come to mind. Anyway, he wrote a book about English monarchies through the ages, and he started with William the Conqueror. All right, hello, and wishing a good day to everyone. This is a monologue, however, it's a lecture, so I appreciate your attendance and everything, but we have to go on with the script. So yes, his name, David Starkey, that's his name, David Starkey. I was influenced by David Starkey when he talked about English monarchies, starting possibly from the Anglo-Saxon kings, the House of Wessex, or when England was a heptarchy, or even at the time of the Romans, all the way to modern day England. I was influenced by that book, by David Starkey, and I wanted to do a Sarawakian version. Now, I know that's a very difficult thing to ask for, because Sarawak's history before the coming of the English is a much harder ordeal to do, and oftentimes enters into the realm of Islamic hagiography to the point where we lose what happened before Islamization. So I decided to do this little quirky adventure. So warning, it's intuitional, not fact, and I got my research from various sources, which I might share with you later on. A great deal of history has to be intuited due to a dearth of research in Brooke, Sarawak. Sarawak is located in northwestern Borneo. It's my homeland. For anyone coming to Borneo, you may contact me, especially to Kuching, my beloved hometown. Okay? And I am a descendant of the nobles that used to rule Sarawak. Hashtag and shout out to Edge of the World. James Brooke actually worked with my paternal grandmother's grandfather's grandfather. His name is Dato' Patinggi Ari, and he was a rebel against the Brunei Sultanate. Okay, so I am a descendant, being an abang-abang, of the aristocracy that ruled Sarawak, and in fact, I am also considered a descendant of Raden Vijaya of the Majapahit Empire. Through very many generations, down to the Prince of Sukadana and Perbaitasari, who is the daughter of Bre Mataram, who ran away during the Paragreg Wars in eastern Java during the time when the Majapahit court had split up in the early 15th century, 1400s. The Empire Majapahit fell in 1526, of course, from very early date to that. And Majapahit is known for its Prime Minister, Gajah Mada, and of course, my ancestor, Hayam Buruk. Okay, who is also known as Mangkubumi Gajah Mada and Pate Hayam Buruk. Is it Raja Hayam Buruk? Now, so I am related to these people, and in that sense, I'm also related to Sultan of Brunei. The Sultan of Brunei is related to me through I'm descended from his mother's side, not the current Sultan of Brunei's mother's side, the founder of the Brunei dynasty, mother's side. Okay, and that goes back to about 700 years ago. So that's all ancient Bornean history, not really ancient, medieval Bornean history. Now, let's come back to this. A great deal, okay, so it's Darth research. There may be history taken from notions of literature, archaeological discoveries, and peripheral histories of the region to make up for the absence of actual historical events. Now, like medieval England, this history is a model by which future historians could use as a framework to develop a sense of who we are as Sarawakians for a much longer period of time rather than from the colonial perspective. Because we're neither colonial, neither Islamic, neither anything of the sort. We are Bornean. We are Sarawakian. That makes us what we are. Number one, prehistory. I call this the Niah Genesis. All right, 500,000 to 10,000 years ago. The earliest find of humans in Sarawak dates back to the Niah caves at around, they said, 38,000 BCE. This is one of the earliest remains of human beings ever discovered in Southeast Asia. So you can search Wikipedia for that. This region was inhabited by humans since 70,000 years before the present. Now there's evidence of Sundaland. Sundaland means the whole of Southeast Asia was a continent at one time, called Sundaland, and only after the Great Deluge, which some people said might be during Noah's time, the Great Deluge. What happened then? The land sunk. The land sunk, okay? The land sunk. And what's left are all the islands and peninsulas and all that, if you know Southeast Asia well, yeah? So this region was inhabited by, okay, since 70,000 years before present. There's evidence that at that time, Mount Toba, which is Lake Toba in Sumatra, it's a massive lake in Sumatra, Danau Toba. It was that is a caldera of a massive volcano that erupted 70,000 years ago, all right? Creating the present-day Danau Toba. Dust clouds from that eruption have helped anthropologists and scientists identify human migration into Southeast Asia from Africa, okay, from the Indian subcontinent about this time. So this was taken from Alice Roberts' The Great Human Journey, which talks about out of Africa, the history of out of Africa, and how the earliest humans came straight from Africa to Southeast Asia in quite a minimal time. We left the African continent about 100,000 years ago, and we arrived in Southeast Asia around 60 to 70,000 years ago, as evidenced, at least in the Indian subcontinent, as evidenced by the remnants of this eruption of Mount Toba. Now, at that time, this land was the largest subcontinent that existed. Sundaland is much larger than India. You can imagine the whole of Southeast Asia as a continent, okay? Sundaland, all right? With the Philippines being the coastal areas and parts of the Spratly Islands inhabiting currently coastal areas, because South China Sea is about 180 meters at most in its depth. It's not a very deep sea. There was a deluge. There's some speculation that Sundaland was the cradle of civilization. We possibly were the Atlantis. If you think about it, we possibly were pre-Atlantean civilizations here. Okay, like, have you seen the submerged, the submerged pyramids off the coast of Okinawa? Have you seen the Mount Gunung Padang as a massive pyramids? These things date back to over 10 to 20,000 years before. So could we be an Atlantean civilization that because of the great deluge, the civilization fell apart and, parts of it went to the Middle East to start what today we call Mesopotamia? We possibly could be pre-Mesopotamian by far. So, and some people said that we are Atlantis because what actually happened is in the Great Ice Age in the north, the tropics would have been a nice Mediterranean-like climate for so-called Atlantean civilization. All right. So we could be the cradle of human civilization before the current round. All right. There is some speculation Sundaland was cradle of civilization before the last ice age. If you believe that cycles of humanity occur, then you are likely to believe that during the Great Ice Age, possibly in the age of Leo, we are now in the age of Aquarius. So you go retro back, age of Leo, age of Aquarius, to age of Pisces. Each retrograde age of the astrological line is about 2,000 years. Okay? So you have what called the age of Leo, which is around just before the Ice Age. All right? We could have been a Leonite civilization. All right. Land here was warm enough to be the beginnings of every civilization. But it was at the end of this Atlantean-like civilization during the Great Inundation, the Great Flood as told in Genesis, that societies fell apart and migrated into forests and thus into nomadic lifestyles. You can take a look at the origin of Malayu video shot, where once the deluge happened, people started going to the mountains. And these mountains were actually the islands of Borneo, Sumatra, Sulawesi, and so forth. And then they started living in isolation. There's evidence that Gunung Padang in West Java, that is not really a mountain, but an ancient prehistoric pyramid built by pre-ancient man. For Niah caves and for Sarawak, this first era of history laid the foundation of our nomadic interior tribes, maybe the Orang Ulu peoples, especially the Penans and Punan Bas, seeking shelter from the rising seas that would form the South China Sea, covering the once lush plains of Lower Sundaland. To show contemporary history in action, Noah could be seen floating around somewhere, possibly at this time in his ark. Number 2, we go into protohistory, what we call Austronesian Sarawak. Austronesian Sarawak. The majority of people in Sarawak are Austronesians, all right? Now, what this means is that, now some people say that we originated the Austronesian culture. Some people say we came from Taiwan based on the Taiwan theory. I'm going to take the Taiwan theory because it's popular. Now, long after the inundation, more people migrated to Borneo, especially from Taiwan via the Philippines. This is known as the Austronesian or South Sea Islander invasion of Borneo, with their cultures like other Orang Ulu peoples, including the Kenya, Kayan, and Aliko peoples. These people later left East Borneo to populate the Pacific Ocean. Many of their descendants today include the Polynesians, Hawaiians, Maoris, and also the Rapa Nui of the Easter Islands. They all possibly came from Borneo. Yes. All right. Evidence of Kenya and Maori having numbers that are 99% identical testify to their relating rather closely to each other. Actually, what happened is I visited New Zealand. And when I visited New Zealand with my friend who was Kenya, Orang Ulu from Sarawak, we went to a Maori village. And in a Maori village, we met a Maori chieftain's wife. And there, the Kenya from Sarawak managed to relate to the Maori. And if you get to look at the culture, it's amazingly similar in the art form. The Kenya Orang Ulu art form and the Maori art form, the carvings are almost very, very similar. And so are their numeric systems and the words for their numbers. are also very similar. I don't even count Kenya, I count Malay, Bahasa Melayu, with Maori is quite similar. The word for two in Malay is dua. The word for two in Maori is rua. The word for land or continent in Malay is benua. The word for continent in Maori is tifenua. Mata, I believe, is head in Maori, while mata in Malay is eyes. So you can see mata, you can see tifenua and benua, rua and dua. All of it's quite similar to each other. So the Maori and the Malays are definitely connected, but more so the indigenous Bornean people. And in that sense, you can say Borneo is a home of surfing, because the Hawaiians who came from East Borneo invented surfing. Borneo is also the home to the Malagasy people, okay? Because from the Barito region, they also migrated westwards to Madagascar. All right. So, there we go. 3, protohistory, Austroasiatic Sarawak. So we also have Austronesian, we also have Austroasiatic, 5,000 to 1,000 years ago. In terms of people in Southeast Asia, the Austroasiatics are ancestors to mainland Southeast Asians, Mon Khmers, who speak the Apatani language, had their beginnings before the Austronesians arrived from Taiwan via the Philippines. But from the Bornean perspective, because we're east, the indigenous were superseded by the Austronesians, then the Asiatics. Whereas in West Malaysia, it was the Australoid Asiatics and then the Austronesians. So it was the other way around, yeah? All right. This occurred when Borneans had international relations with Funan and Champa in Indochina, today's Vietnam. They exchanged cultural items of the Bronze Age, such as the Dong Song drums, thus creating Austroasiatic cultures within mainly what I conceive as Bidayu and the Dayaks of Kalimantan. Is a mixture of Austroasiatic and Austronesian. Thank you very much. This stands to reason that most Bidayan cultural ways mimic those of northeastern Thailand or Vietnamese agrarian cultures, with similarities also in the language. And the word Patani, which is the very word itself for farm in Malay, comes from the Apatani language. Another word is Datuk and Apa. Okay, all come from the ancient Apatani language, which is in the Mon Khmer world, yeah? This is before Thai cultures came in, okay? Number 4, classical history, Srivijayan Sarawak. After Borneans migrated across to Java, Sumatra, and Malaya, possibly peopling and bringing ancient cultures to these lands, whilst displacing Australoid Aborigines, they managed to cultivate. The only place where Austronesian did not replace Aborigines is Australia. We can't say Malaya because Malaya has Austronesian people in terms of the Deutero Malays, yeah? But in Papua New Guinea and in Australia, they're mostly Australoid, Negrito, yeah? Whereas, so there was some displacement between these two groups. Also, they managed to cultivate civilization and culture, which included indigenization of Indian civilization at Kedah, followed by Srivijaya, displacing Funan in Champa as center of Malay culture. Srivijayan sailors spread Malay culture to Borneo and traded with settlements there. When we talk about Malay culture here, we're talking about Bahasa Melayu Kuno, and we're talking about Adat Melayu. We're not talking about Islam. We may be talking about Buddhism, Tantric Buddhism, because Malays were very much people who followed Tantric Buddhism. So wherever you see Malays actually established Buddhist shrines, even in China, all right, during the Tang Dynasty. Tang Dynasty, year 600 something, Malays were not Muslim then. They were Buddhists. The Chinese learnt Buddhism from the Malays. They came down, like I Ching came down to Palembang, Sumatra, to learn Buddhism from the Malays. You had to learn Bahasa Melayu to understand Buddhism. And then after that, go on to Nalanda University in India. So on their way to India, people like the I Ching stopped in Sumatra, stopped in Srivijaya to learn about Buddhism. If you look at Prambanan and Borobudur, these are, one is Hindu and the other one's a Buddhist. These are all monuments that go back to the time when we were harbingers of this religion. Don't let one religion today take over the fact that this is our heritage and our culture, and that we should think and look back to what was it like back then as well. Okay? The son of Majapahit today is telling you this, yeah? Now, if you want to know what Malay culture is like, look at the Balinese people of today. That is the remnant of the Majapahit Empire in Bali. They brought with them the Malay way of doing things and settled some Malays in some of the settlements along the coast. They introduced Tantric Buddhism, which is a Malay religion, and the Hindu cult of Shiva, which has a shrine at Bongkisam in the kingdom of Santubong, Sarawak. Number 5, classical history, Majapahit Sarawak. Okay, Tanjung Pura, as the Javanese called it, was an escapist paradise from wars and intrigues of Java. During Prapanka's Negara Kertagama, published in 1369, okay, written under the reign of Hayam Buruk, my ancestor, Majapahit determines its many trading colonies in Borneo, including Sawaku, Sadong, Kalaka, and Samarahan. It was written in 1365. You already had words like Samarahan in 1365. You had words like Sadong, Kalaka. Sarawak actually had a name, Sawaku, my farmland. It was also a time when Iban culture was growing along the Kapuas River, Delta in western Borneo, under certain fashionable auspices of ancient Javanese dress. Now this is only intuition, but if you notice the Balinese dancers and the Iban dancers, the women, how they wear something quite similar, is there not a historical connection between them two? And possibly between ancient Egypt, if you notice how Egyptian women also wore a similar thing. It's something to think about, yeah? All right. These are when the Austroasiatics of West Kalimantan or the Selakaus, a relation of Bidayus and Sarawak, became more Ibanic in their ways. Compare, if you will, the remnant of Majapahit clothing in Bali with that of Iban women as being an anthropologically noticeable similarity which may or may not have its roots in some undocumented history. Again, evidenced by present-day observation. Postulations run amok herein. So I'm just postulating. Number 6, we call this medieval history. Medieval history because it's around the same time as medieval history in Europe. We don't have medieval history in Southeast Asia. There is no such thing as medieval history in Southeast Asia. Medieval basically means a time between the fall of the Romans and the rise of the nation states in Europe, or the Renaissance. That is medieval. We don't have such a thing in Southeast Asia. There were no Romans in Southeast Asia, except by trade, and they did not have an effect on our culture as they did in Europe. So you cannot say that Southeast Asia had a medieval time. We had a contemporaneous medieval period, which is possibly around 1300s to 1500s, in the sense that we had feudal cultures here. It was quite similar to medieval ways of life, but in no way is it related to the exact form of what medieval means in European history. So let's not transport historical understandings across continents here. Let's try and understand it from the hermeneutics, once again, of this place. So I call this Singaporean Sarawak, or Sarawak under the ancient Johorian rule, centered in Singapore, the time of Sang Nila Utama, times of legendary figures. We all think of Singapore today as being quite a center of Southeast Asian culture. Actually, Singapura, the ancient kingdom, also had a lot of influence over Southeast Asia, as we'll later see. 1300s to 1500s. And Singapore at many times has influenced the course of history of Sarawak more than we can give credit for. All right. I've always wondered why Sarawak's connection with Singapore was so electric. When I was growing up, so much so that many Sarawakian Malays even chose Singapore over KL as their heart center. That includes my dad to a certain extent. Then it must be that at one time Singapore held a magnetism over Sarawak, and here's how it went. For Singapore, the city was founded by Sang Nila Utama at the end of the Srivijayan period. Malay culture had lost its center due to Javanese and Tamil attacks on its capital in both Kedah and Palembang, respectively. Between the Cholas, who built the grand temples of southern India, and the Sailendras, who built both Borobudur and Prambanan in Java, Srivijaya's thalassocracy was no match. But in establishing Singapore on its last breath, was quite like how Superman's parents sent him off Krypton before the planet blew up. It was a lasting time bomb for the Javanese and Hindu empires. For a time would come when Malay culture would be resurgent. By the 1400s, Singapore's last monarch, Paramiswara, founded Malacca, and Majapahit's very own court intrigues in Java sent a Javanese prince, Raden Adipati, to Sumatra and there married a daughter of the Minangkabau king Raja Jarom. Together they leave for Santubong and established a polity there. So both Malacca in Malaya and Santubong, which later became Sarawak in Borneo, were established as the Malay remnants of the very empires that destroyed the old thalassocracy. Talk about karma. While at the same time Raja Tugau of Malano, a descendant of the Aliko peoples, who were influenced by Iranian or Filipino cultures, mainly the Maranao cultures, wanted to invade the kingdom of Brunei. But in turn, its king Awang Alap Batata attacked the Malano territories and expanded its frontiers there too. These Filipino band of pirates were also attacked by a sea dragon, believed to be the resurrected soul of Raden Adipati's youngest child, who died before her mother was abandoned on the shores of Miri. By the way, Raden Adipati is my ancestor. Yeah. All right. As the king of Brunei embraced Islam, he was married to the daughter of a descendant of Sang Nila Utama in Singapore, and as a result was awarded 4 kingdoms of Sarawak, Santubong, Malacca, Sadong, and Samarahan. This happened in 1479, all of which happened under the watchful eye of the old Johor kingdom established in Singapore in the 14th to 15th centuries. This is not the kingdom of Johor that came from the fall of Malacca. This is a kingdom of Johor that's established by ancient Singapore under Sang Nila Utama. The next one I put here is Medieval History, Brunei and Sarawak, Part 1. As a gift of ancient Johor or Singapore to Brunei, Sarawak was awarded as a gift to Brunei due to the intermarriage between the first Sultan of Brunei and the daughter of a Malay king in Johor or Singapore. During these times, my family, Parabangan Sarawak, founded by Raden Adipati's dynasty, continues to grow and influence the various kingdoms that have arisen in Sarawak. This is known as the Nakhoda period, as the rights of each territory prospers independently under the captain of the port or Nakhoda, though at the same time tax is collected for Kota Batu in Brunei. Number 8, early modern history, the Sultanate of Sarawak Darul Hana, 1599 to 1641. 120 years later, due to civil war, at the demise of Sultan Muhammad Hassan in 1598, Pangeran Tengah, the legitimate heir to the previous sultan, was exiled to Sarawak to begin a new court here. He came with many Bruneian natives as well as Bruneian courtiers to establish his capital at Santubong. While establishing his sultanate, which was titled Sarawak Darul Hana, he went to Pahang to visit his aunt, who had married the Sultan of Pahang at the time. Due to some mischief that happened there, he was asked to leave the court, either due to being angry with a dancer during a planned wedding with the princess or refusing to marry Cik Zohra, the princess. On his way back to Sarawak, he stopped at Sukadana, Sambas, and Matan, which are in western Borneo. In these places, he married and left legacies of his seed to continue the line of the kingdoms into Islamic sultanates. So a lot of sultanates that grew up in Kalimantan, Indonesia, which lost their right to rule because of the republic, but are considered heritage sultanates, have got a kind of connection with Brunei Darussalam through the one and only Sultan of Sarawak, who was on throne in Sarawak in the 17th century. So, in these places, he married and left legacies of his seed to continue. Okay, so he thus returned to Sarawak and was assassinated in the shadows of Mount Santubong in 1641. On your way to Damai Beach, if those who have been to Damai Beach, as you go up to Damai Beach on the right-hand side and Santubong village on the left, just at the bottom of that hill, is the makam of Sultan Pangeran Tengah, who is the only Sultan of Sarawak. Yeah, worthwhile to go in and have a little visit. It's got a little, it's been modernized and has an Islamic, a very nice Islamic exterior architecturally. Yeah, okay. So he was assassinated in 1641. You can spot his resting place on the way to Damai Beach. Even though his royal legacy has peppered Kalimantan, Indonesia with royals of Bruneian descent, he left no heirs in Sarawak. But instead, and slowly, the Parabangan administration, yes, it says here, even though his royal legacy has peppered Kalimantan, Indonesia with royals of Bruneian descent, he left no heirs in Sarawak. But the makam is in Sarawak now. All right. For those who want this document, please direct message me. All right. And I can always send it to you via email. I also hold one-to-one history classes for 30 ringgit on Zoom, by the way, for those who are interested in learning history or even alternative history, as well as English and creative writing. Now, coming back to this, it was also in the era of Sarawak Darul Hana that the Ibans of Kapuas migrated into lands belonging to the Bruneian fiefdom of Saribas Kalaka at Batang Ai. These newly evolved Dayaks would influence Sarawakian culture to such an extent as being the main native group come the 20th century. Number 9, early modern history, Brunei and Sarawak Part 2. The 18th century, 1700s can be earmarked as the century of Iban influence in Sarawak. Marauding across the country, they influenced where the various cultures would establish hegemony, with themselves hemming in some tribes in certain areas whilst hinging the others closer to the coast. They worked in collaboration with the Filipino Iranuns or pirates, so much so that Borneo became unsafe for mariners and a haven for piratical activities, and also the headhunting or ngayao. It is said that the Alikos of Malanaos were already coastal since their kingdom's apex, but a lot more remained in the interior along the Rajang River. It was during the Iban raids that the Rajang, Lupa, and Saribas rivers became exclusively their territory, building different Ibanic identities. Thus, most of the Aliko interior communities migrated to the Malanao coast during this time to seek refuge with their fellow men. It was also during this era that the Kayans named these groups of marauding Dayaks by their current name Ivans, which means wanderers, or people who jalan-jalan. The Kayans and Kenyas were their territorial competitors, especially at the Rajang's headwaters. This era also spelled closer ties between territories acceded to Brunei, beginning with the former districts of the Malanao Kingdom. Malano, Saribas Kalaka, and Samarahan Sadong were all obliged to give a good deal of their monthly profits to the Sultan directly. Their status changed from Kerajaan to Kuripan. At this point in time, due to being so distant, and at the same time closer to the Sultanate of Sambas, especially in kinship, Sarawak was left alone. And none other enjoyed that status of loneliness than the king of the South China Sea's pirates, Samhuda, I think his name was. In 1819, that all changed. Singapore, founded by Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles, had just begun a British factory close to Sarawak. The Sultanate of Brunei, seeing that gold and antimony was found in the upper reaches of the Sarawak River at Lidatana, tongue of the earth, and was close enough to trade with Singapore, held that Sarawak's turn to change from Kerajaan to Kuripan. Sent to monitor the change was Pangeran Indra Mahkota Muhammad Saleh, who changed the center of rule from Lidatana to Sungai Kuching, thus founding Kuching as the capital of Sarawak. A rebellion in Siniawan by my own ancestors at Lidatana erupted against the Brunei officials in Kuching in 1836. The Sultan's uncle, Raja Muda Hashim, was sent to quell the rebellion. During his tenure, a couple of English sailors were rescued from a shipwreck just off the Santabong coast. They were sent back to Singapore with riveting tales of the Raja of Borneo's kindness and generosity. I wonder who went sailing down after this and ended up with having to quell the rebellion instead. Okay, shout out in reference to Edge of the World, yeah? Well, number 10 is colonial history, the Kingdom of Sarawak, Brooke Raj of Sarawak. Now, this is where our tale ends. Rest assured, much has been written about this era. It's not even worth mentioning much anymore. Let's just say an explorer called James Brooke came in, ousted the Bruneians, took the territory for himself through gunboat diplomacy, and resurrected the place of my ancestors, the Parabangans, to their questionable yet rightful place of Sarawak's original rulers, which later became chief native officers, then nothing except the first governor of Malaysia and today's chief minister or premier of Sarawak. All right, so that is roughly an intuitive history of Sarawak, and I thank you all for your interest. And as I said, if you need any of the documents for this one, as I said, this is not really history. This is just a quirky attempt at history based on some findings here and there. But I just want to tell you that we don't need to look at Sarawak's history from the perspective of the 19th century, but from the perspective of a long duree history from earlier times to now, and see that there is that connection that makes us Sarawak. And by the way, what really, really helms in this pre-Brooke Sarawakian history is that my ancestor, Raden Adipati, Datuk Merpati Raden Gusti, the father of Merpati Jepang, who is my ancestor, and his wife Raja Permaisuri Kasuma, Kamala Kasuma, that's her name. Both of them who met in Singapore during the ancient times came. One is the daughter of Raja Jarum of Sumatra. The other one is the son of the Prince of Sukadana, whose wife was Parbaitasari, who ran away from the Majapahit court, and descendants of Majapahit royalty. Both came together in Singapore and established Sarawak today. And how do we know that? Geographically, what happened was pirates kidnapped Dayang Sri Bulan, the daughter of this couple, and the wife herself, Raja Permaisuri Kamalakasuma, and because of that, they remained in Miri, in Pujut. Her makam is in Pujut. And Datuk Mapati or Raden Adipati's makam is in Tanjung Datuk. That's why it's called Tanjung Datuk. Datuk Mapati is buried at Tanjung Datuk in the west, and Datuk Permaisuri Kamala Kasuma is buried in a tomb in Pujut in Miri. What lies between the two is, well, excluding Limbang, is Sarawak. So there you go. How important it is to know our ancient history and be proud of our ancient history, even though it's not as ancient as some histories. But, if we look into it a bit more, maybe use this as a model to figure it out and to see history, not from any religious perspective, but from what it is, through archaeology, through discovery, through context. And a lot of this stuff comes from the Sila Raja Barunai. If you have a look at that, and through genealogy, you can find something that is worth. And for that, I thank you for your time and all the best. As I said, I am a tutor for history, which you can get for 30 ringgit an hour, or for Bahasa Melayu if you want to learn Malay, or English language. I have my own syllabus, as well as creative writing. There's a very good creative writing course I'm doing right now, based on some of the stories I'm creating. And I can produce AI production from that. So there's many things you can ask me for, and please DM me for all those lovely things. All right, thank you for listening, and have a good day.